In the spring of 1945, as British forces pushed deeper into Western Germany, they moved through landscapes that no longer resembled towns but open wounds. Entire villages stood roofless, church towers split by artillery, schoolhouses reduced to brick and chalk dust. After the crossing of the Rhine during Operation Plunder in March 1945, units of the British Second Army advanced rapidly, often encountering places where Nazi authority had collapsed overnight. In many of these villages, the war did not end cleanly. It fractured. Power shifted from uniformed officials to frightened civilians, former party loyalists, and anyone loud enough to claim control. British officers were trained to expect resistance from remaining Wehrmacht units or isolated SS detachments. What they were less prepared for was the chaos of accusation. In the final weeks of the war, Germany was saturated with fear. Years of propaganda had encouraged citizens to report one another. The term Volksverräter, meaning traitor to the people, was not abstract rhetoric. It was a charge that could lead to imprisonment or execution, especially under the authority of local Nazi officials or improvised people's courts inspired by Roland Freisler's infamous Volksgerichtshof. As Allied forces approached, that culture of denunciation did not disappear. In some places, it intensified. When British troops entered shattered villages in April 1945, they sometimes found civilians already punishing those accused of collaboration, desertion, or defeatism. Women suspected of relationships with foreign laborers were humiliated. Men accused of surrender talk were beaten. Nurses and doctors who had treated prisoners of war could fall under suspicion from hardliners who believed mercy itself was betrayal. By this stage of the war, the Nazi regime had ordered total resistance. Posters declared that anyone undermining morale was an enemy within. The front line was not only military, it was social. German medical personnel occupied a particularly dangerous moral position. Officially, they were bound by professional ethics and, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, required to provide care to wounded prisoners of war. Germany was a signatory. In many cases, military nurses treated Allied POWs in field hospitals and transit camps. Some did so strictly under orders. Others extended quiet acts of humanity, extra bandages, whispered reassurance, a moment of dignity. But by 1945, with Allied bombings devastating cities like Cologne and Hamburg, and Soviet forces advancing brutally from the east, emotions were raw. Compassion toward enemy soldiers could be twisted into suspicion. As the British Army entered Western Germany, their own orders were clear: restore order, disarm remaining forces, secure infrastructure, and prevent reprisals. Commanders understood that vengeance could spiral quickly. In other liberated parts of Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, spontaneous reprisals against alleged collaborators had already erupted. Public shaming, beatings, even summary executions occurred before formal legal systems were restored. British officers had seen what mob justice looked like. They knew how fast it could turn. Imagine, then, a village square in April 1945. The air still smells of smoke from recent shelling. Civilians gather not in celebration of liberation, but in agitation. In the center stands a wooden post, once used for market notices or festival decorations. Now it holds a person, a nurse in a torn gray uniform, marked not by insignia of rank, but by exhaustion. Above her, painted in harsh block letters, the word Verräterin, traitor. This was not an uncommon accusation in the final months of the Third Reich. Records from local archives across Germany show cases where women were accused of defeatism for saying the war was lost. Others were reported for giving bread to foreign laborers.
In some towns, self-appointed vigilante groups formed as official authority disintegrated. They claimed to defend honor, but often they defended fear. For a British lieutenant stepping into that square, the situation would not be simple. The war was effectively won. Berlin would fall within weeks. Yet here, in a ruined village, the conflict had shifted from artillery to judgment. British officers were not judges of German civilians by default. Their immediate responsibility was military security, but occupation policy also required stabilization. Allowing violence to continue unchecked contradicted the very principles the Allies claimed to restore: rule of law, due process, and the rejection of arbitrary punishment. There are documented cases of Allied soldiers intervening to stop summary punishments. Diaries from British servicemen describe moments of confusion. Who was victim? Who was perpetrator? A woman labeled collaborator might have been coerced. A man accused of loyalty to the regime might have been a conscript with no political power. The collapse of Nazi Germany revealed not a simple division between guilty and innocent, but a tangled web of survival. The charge of treason in 1945 carried deep emotional weight. Germany had endured 6 years of total war. Sons had died at Stalingrad. Cities had burned under bombing campaigns. Propaganda insisted that betrayal, not strategic failure, explained defeat. In that atmosphere, a nurse accused of aiding enemy prisoners could become a symbol onto which grief and rage were projected. She was visible, she was vulnerable, and she wore a uniform that tied her to a state that was disintegrating. For the British officer, the decision would reflect more than personal compassion. It would test the meaning of liberation itself. Was the role of the occupying force merely to defeat armies or to prevent the birth of new injustices in the ruins? Military law and the Geneva Conventions emphasized protection for medical personnel. Even enemy nurses, once disarmed and no longer engaged in combat operations, were not lawful targets of punishment without formal process. In many villages, Allied troops discovered that the end of centralized terror did not automatically produce justice. It produced a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed rumor, vengeance, and fear. The image of a nurse tied to a post beneath the word traitor captures a broader historical truth about the final weeks of World War II in Europe. The battlefield had shifted inward. The enemy was no longer only across the front line. It was suspicion within communities, suspicion sharpened by years of indoctrination. By May 1945, Germany would formally surrender. Occupation authorities would establish tribunals, denazification processes, and structured investigations. But in April, in countless shattered squares, judgment was improvised. The war had taught people to see betrayal everywhere. And sometimes the most radical act in that moment was not punishment, but restraint. This is the tension at the heart of that scene: a defeated nation confronting its own conscience, and a victorious army deciding whether victory included mercy.
By 1945, the German military medical system was stretched to its limits. Years of total war had drained hospitals of supplies, trained personnel, and even electricity. Field hospitals followed retreating divisions westward, setting up in schools, churches, and railway depots. Nurses, many of them in their 20s, worked through bombing raids and artillery fire, treating shattered limbs, burns, and infections with dwindling morphine stocks. Officially, their duty was clear: care for wounded German soldiers and, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, provide treatment to prisoners of war without discrimination. In practice, that duty could place them in quiet conflict with ideology. The Nazi regime had long demanded absolute loyalty. Medical professionals were not immune to political scrutiny. Since 1933, doctors and nurses had been required to align themselves with state policy, and many were members of Nazi-affiliated organizations. Yet membership did not always equal fanaticism.
Some joined for career survival. Others believed in the regime early on, but became disillusioned as casualty lists lengthened and cities turned to rubble. By the final year of the war, ideological certainty had eroded for many ordinary Germans, replaced by exhaustion and fear. Treating Allied prisoners could be especially dangerous in certain contexts. Although international law mandated humane care, propaganda portrayed enemy soldiers as existential threats. In the West, British and American POWs were sometimes held in transit camps near civilian populations. Nurses assigned to these facilities were expected to follow regulations strictly. However, testimonies collected after the war reveal that small acts of compassion were not uncommon. A blanket given during winter transport, a wound rebandaged more carefully than required, a few extra words spoken in halting English. Such gestures were rarely dramatic, but in an atmosphere of suspicion, they could be interpreted as sympathy. As Germany's military position collapsed in late 1944 and early 1945, internal paranoia intensified. After the failed July 20 plot against Adolf Hitler in 1944, the regime launched waves of arrests. The People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler until his death in an air raid in February 1945, handed down thousands of death sentences for treason and defeatism. Even casual remarks that the war was lost could trigger denunciation. Posters and radio broadcasts urged citizens to report cowards and traitors. In that climate, professional neutrality could be misread as disloyalty. Local Nazi party officials, Volkssturm leaders, and remnants of SS units often exercised disproportionate power as central command structures disintegrated. In small towns, authority could fall into the hands of the most zealous remaining figure. If a nurse had been seen speaking kindly to a captured Allied airman, or if she had argued that a wounded prisoner deserved proper anesthesia, such behavior might be twisted into evidence of betrayal. The label Verräterin did not require proof beyond rumor once legal norms had collapsed. There are documented examples from the final months of the war where civilians or local officials punished individuals accused of defeatism before Allied forces even arrived. Some were hung from lampposts with placards describing their alleged crimes. Others were beaten publicly. The regime itself had encouraged such spectacles to deter dissent, but by 1945, these punishments were often carried out not through formal courts, but through improvised gatherings fueled by panic. As front lines shifted rapidly westward, communities felt abandoned. Fear demanded a target. A nurse accused of treason could represent multiple anxieties at once. She embodied the state through her uniform, yet she was not an armed combatant. She had proximity to the wounded, to whispers from the front, to the truth about how badly the war was going. Medical workers often knew before civilians did that divisions had been destroyed or that supplies were gone. Knowledge itself could be dangerous. If she had said aloud that surrender would save lives, that statement alone might be remembered later as defeatism. Gender also shaped perception. Women in uniform challenged traditional expectations even within Nazi ideology, which idealized them primarily as mothers and supporters of soldiers. While nurses were respected publicly, they were also vulnerable to moral judgment. Accusations of improper relationships with foreign laborers or prisoners could spread quickly. In occupied territories earlier in the war, such rumors had destroyed reputations. In Germany itself, as defeat loomed, standards tightened rather than loosened. Community honor became a fragile shield people clung to as bombs fell. By April 1945, transportation networks were in chaos. Hospitals evacuated patients on foot or by horse-drawn carts. Some nurses were left behind when units retreated too quickly. If one remained in a village after the Wehrmacht withdrew, her presence alone might raise suspicion. Why had she not fled eastward? Was she hiding something? Had she cooperated with the enemy? These questions required no evidence to gain momentum in a traumatized population. When British troops entered such villages, they often encountered conflicting stories. Civilians might insist that an accused person had endangered them all by weakening morale. Others would whisper that she had simply followed medical ethics. Post-war investigations revealed how easily denunciations had spread during the regime's final phase. Fear of being accused oneself encouraged participation in accusation. Condemning someone else could be a way of proving loyalty. The concept of treason had been stretched so far by 1945 that it no longer meant espionage or armed betrayal. It could mean compassion shown to the wrong person. It could mean predicting defeat too early. It could mean refusing to join a last-ditch militia unit. In that environment, a nurse's decision to prioritize a patient's humanity over propaganda could transform her from caregiver to scapegoat. As Allied forces closed in from both west and east, many Germans sensed that a reckoning was coming. Some tried to erase evidence of party membership. Others attempted to demonstrate continued loyalty, hoping to avoid suspicion later. Publicly condemning a supposed traitor was one way to signal allegiance to whichever authority might prevail. The tragedy is that such gestures often targeted the least powerful individuals. The image of a nurse bound beneath a sign accusing her of betrayal reflects not only personal accusation, but systemic collapse. The institutions that once defined guilt and innocence were gone, were discredited. In their place stood rumor, fear, and the desperate need to assign blame for a catastrophe that had consumed an entire generation. Within that chaos, the line between moral courage and perceived treason could vanish overnight.
By the time British forces entered Western Germany in the spring of 1945, they were not stepping into orderly towns awaiting liberation. They were entering societies in psychological collapse. The Third Reich had conditioned its citizens for years to believe that defeat would mean annihilation. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels repeatedly warned that the enemy would bring destruction, revenge, and humiliation. When Allied troops finally appeared, many civilians were trapped between relief and terror, and in that emotional fracture, justice often gave way to revenge. Across Europe, the end of occupation triggered waves of spontaneous reprisals. In France and the Netherlands, women accused of collaborating with German soldiers had their heads publicly shaved. Men suspected of informing were beaten or executed without trial. Historians estimate that in France alone, thousands were killed in the chaotic months surrounding liberation before formal courts were re-established. The pattern was consistent. When central authority collapses, communities often turn inward to purge themselves. Germany in April 1945 was no different, but the circumstances were more volatile. Unlike occupied Western Europe, Germany had been the aggressor nation. Civilians had lived for years under a regime that criminalized dissent and glorified loyalty. Now that regime was disintegrating in real time. Local Nazi officials fled, SS units retreated or dissolved. The Volkssturm, civilian militias formed in the war's final phase, were often poorly armed and poorly led. In this vacuum, power shifted to whoever could command attention in the village square. Mob psychology thrives in uncertainty. Social historians describe how fear and humiliation create a powerful need for visible accountability. Someone must be responsible. Someone must be punished. In a bombed-out town where sons had died on the Eastern Front and homes had been reduced to rubble by Allied air raids, grief had nowhere organized to go. There were no functioning courts, no trusted authorities, no clear future. A single accused individual could become a vessel for collective anger. The label traitor carried explosive weight. Under Nazi law, treason and defeatism were capital offenses. Even in the regime's final weeks, summary executions were carried out against German soldiers accused of desertion. Field tribunals sometimes hanged teenagers from trees with placards declaring them cowards. Civilians saw these spectacles. They learned that loyalty was enforced publicly.
When central control vanished, communities sometimes imitated the very brutality they had lived under. For a British officer arriving in such a scene, the challenge was immediate and delicate. The British Army had strict operational priorities: secure remaining weapons, prevent sabotage, stabilize infrastructure, and maintain discipline among troops. Soldiers were instructed not to engage in unnecessary interference in civilian disputes unless violence threatened broader security. Yet allowing a crowd to punish someone without due process risked undermining the principles the Allies claimed to defend. Occupation policy manuals emphasized restoring order quickly to prevent exactly this kind of chaos. British commanders understood that revenge cycles could destabilize regions long after combat ended. In liberated Belgium and the Netherlands, Allied authorities had already witnessed how public reprisals could spiral beyond control. Military police units were sometimes deployed specifically to disperse crowds and prevent lynchings. The ethical tension was profound. On one hand, German civilians had supported or at least tolerated a regime responsible for immense destruction. British troops had seen concentration camps, forced labor sites, and the aftermath of indiscriminate warfare. Anger towards Germany was not abstract, it was personal. Many British troops had lost friends in Normandy, Arnhem, or during the Battle of the Bulge. Sympathy did not come easily. On the other hand, the Allied war effort had been framed as a fight against tyranny, not against an entire people. The Atlantic Charter and later declarations emphasized justice, not vengeance. If Allied soldiers permitted mob punishment in the streets, what distinguished their victory from the lawlessness they condemned? In many documented cases, British officers found themselves acting as reluctant arbiters. Diaries and regimental histories recount moments when crowds demanded immediate punishment of alleged collaborators. Sometimes the accused were genuine perpetrators, other times they were scapegoats chosen for convenience. Without functioning courts, determining truth on the spot was nearly impossible. Psychologists studying post-conflict societies note that transitional moments are particularly volatile. The end of war removes the external enemy, forcing communities to confront internal fractures. Old grudges resurface. Rumors gain momentum because there is no trusted institution left to verify facts. In April 1945, German villages were saturated with rumor: who had denounced whom, who had joined the party late, who had tried to surrender early. Each story carried consequences. In that environment, tying someone to a post beneath a sign reading "Traitor" was more than punishment. It was performance. It signaled to neighbors and to approaching Allied troops that the village rejected betrayal. It was an attempt to rewrite identity in real time. "We are not all guilty," the sign implied. "She is." For a British lieutenant standing before that scene, the question was immediate: intervene or observe. Cutting her down could inflame the crowd. Doing nothing could legitimize extrajudicial punishment. His authority rested not only on military power, but on perception. If he appeared indifferent, resentment might fester. If he appeared heavy-handed, he risked confirming fears of foreign domination. History shows that stabilization often depended on small, decisive actions. An officer ordering soldiers to fix bayonets and disperse a mob could prevent bloodshed. Equally, a calm conversation with village elders could diffuse tension. The presence of disciplined troops alone sometimes shifted dynamics, reminding civilians that a new authority had arrived. The deeper struggle was symbolic. Germany's regime had normalized public humiliation as a political tool. From early boycotts of Jewish businesses in 1933 to later executions of alleged traitors, spectacle had been central to control. Allowing another spectacle, even against someone accused of aiding the enemy, risked perpetuating that culture. In the ruins of 1945, justice was fragile. Courts would eventually reopen. Denazification panels would review cases, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes controversially. But in that immediate moment, in the shattered square of a defeated nation, the line between justice and revenge depended not on grand speeches or treaties, but on the decision of individuals faced with a crowd and a sign. War destroyed buildings. Now it threatened to destroy the possibility of fairness. Whether order would replace fury depended on whether someone was willing to step forward and insist that even a defeated enemy deserved something more than a rope and a word painted in black.
By April 1945, the British Army was operating not only as a fighting force, but as an occupying authority in the making. The rapid collapse of German resistance in the West forced officers to confront decisions for which no battlefield training fully prepared them. Combat doctrine addressed enemy positions, artillery coordination, and defensive lines. It did not offer simple answers for a bound civilian accused of treason by her own neighbors. British forces advancing through northwestern Germany were under strict instructions regarding conduct. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, was part of their professional framework. Medical personnel, even enemy medical personnel, were granted protected status under international law. They were not to be harmed if they were not actively participating in hostilities. A German nurse, disarmed and no longer attached to a fighting unit, fell into a gray but significant category: not a combatant, not an immediate threat. At the same time, British soldiers had been exposed to years of propaganda and lived experience that hardened attitudes toward Germany. The Blitz had devastated London and other cities. Families back home had endured rationing, bomb shelters, and casualty telegrams. By 1945, reports of concentration camps, such as Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British forces in April, began circulating among troops. The scale of Nazi crimes was becoming undeniable. Compassion toward Germans was emotionally complicated. Yet British military discipline depended on consistency. Commanders understood that occupying forces must embody order. In previous campaigns, including in Italy and North Africa, British units had been warned about the dangers of indiscipline in liberated territories. Looting, revenge, or arbitrary punishment undermined strategic goals. An officer's authority was measured not only by aggression in battle, but by restraint in victory. The situation in a village square where a nurse stood accused of betrayal was therefore more than local drama. It was a test of what Allied victory meant in practice. If she had aided an Allied prisoner, bandaged a British pilot more carefully than required, perhaps, hidden him briefly from harsher authorities, her actions might align with the very humanitarian standards Britain claimed to defend. But from the perspective of villagers who had lost sons or endured air raids, her compassion could appear as disloyalty. British officers were trained to gather information before acting. Field intelligence did not stop when shooting ended. In occupied areas, questioning civilians became routine. Who held authority? Were there remaining armed units? Were there mines or sabotage plans? In such a tense scene, a lieutenant might separate the loudest accusers from the accused and seek clarity. Who witnessed her alleged betrayal? Was there evidence or only rumor amplified by fear? Historical records from occupation archives show that many accusations made in April and May 1945 dissolved under scrutiny. Some were based on personal grudges that predated the war. Others were attempts for former party members to redirect suspicion away from themselves. Denunciation had been normalized under Nazi rule. After its collapse, the habit did not immediately disappear. It simply shifted targets. For the nurse herself, the psychological burden would have been immense. Medical workers often developed close bonds with the wounded. They saw suffering stripped of ideology.
A shattered leg looked the same whether it belonged to a German infantryman or a captured British airman. In field hospitals, survival frequently depended on triage decisions made under pressure, guided by training rather than politics. If she had followed that ethic faithfully, she might have crossed invisible lines in a regime that demanded ideological loyalty over professional neutrality. British occupation policy also emphasized preventing vigilante violence to avoid long-term instability. A public execution or humiliation could create martyrs or deepen resentment. Stability required predictability. If civilians believed that Allied forces would allow spontaneous punishment, fear would continue to govern daily life. Conversely, if they saw that even an accused traitor was entitled to procedure, it signaled a break from arbitrary terror. There were documented instances in which British officers intervened directly in similar circumstances. Military police units sometimes cut down individuals marked for execution by local groups. In other cases, suspects were taken into temporary custody until proper authorities could review charges. These decisions were rarely dramatic acts of heroism. They were administrative, deliberate, and sometimes unpopular. Crowds did not always respond with gratitude, but over time, such interventions contributed to restoring civil order. The weight of the decision rested more than on law. It rested on example. Soldiers under that officer's command were watching. Civilians were watching. The manner in which he handled one bound nurse communicated the standards of the new authority replacing the Reich. Victory was no longer measured in captured bridges or surrendered divisions. It was measured in whether power would be exercised with restraint. The moral complexity of April 1945 lies in its ambiguity. Many Germans were complicit in sustaining the regime. Many were also trapped within it. A nurse accused of betrayal might have once saluted Hitler Youth parades. She might also have risked punishment to ease a prisoner's pain. History rarely offers pure figures of innocence or guilt in such moments. It offers individuals navigating systems larger than themselves. In the end, the choice before a British officer was stark but deeply human. Allow the logic of accusation to continue unchecked, or interrupt it with the discipline of law. The war against Nazi Germany was nearly over. The larger question was what would replace it. If the future was to be built on principles of justice, those principles had to begin in small, fragile spaces, like a ruined village square, where a single word painted in black ink threatened to define a life. The silence after such a decision would have been heavy. Crowds disperse slowly. Dust settles. Soldiers return to formation. But moments like that echo beyond the square. They become part of how communities remember the day the war truly ended, not when the guns fell silent, but when vengeance was denied the final word.
When Germany formally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the guns fell silent, but judgment did not. Across the country, Allied occupation authorities faced a question far more complicated than defeating armies: how to confront guilt in a nation where millions had participated in, benefited from, or simply endured the Nazi system. The image of a single accused traitor in a village square reflected a much larger reckoning that was only beginning. The Allied powers quickly divided Germany into occupation zones. The British administered the Northwest, including heavily industrial regions and port cities. Their task was enormous: disarmament, food distribution, infrastructure repair, and political restructuring. But alongside these practical concerns came denazification. The goal was to remove committed Nazis from positions of influence while allowing ordinary life to resume. It was a delicate balance between accountability and stability. Denazification tribunals required Germans to fill out detailed questionnaires about party membership, organizational affiliations, and wartime roles.
Millions were investigated. Some were banned from public office or professional work. Others were classified as followers rather than active participants. The process was uneven and often controversial. In some cases, it punished minor figures harshly, while major perpetrators escaped scrutiny by blending into the chaos of defeat. For medical personnel, post-war evaluation could be especially complex. Doctors who had participated in forced sterilization programs or concentration camp experiments faced prosecution in trials such as those held in Nuremberg. But the vast majority of nurses and physicians had served in conventional military or civilian hospitals. Their actions were judged in shades of gray. Providing care to enemy prisoners was not a crime, it was a legal obligation. Yet local reputations could linger long after official investigations ended. Communities, too, struggled with memory. In the immediate aftermath of war, many Germans portrayed themselves primarily as victims of bombing, of dictatorship, of circumstance. Public discussion of complicity evolved slowly over decades. In 1945, survival overshadowed introspection. Food shortages were severe. Millions of refugees fled westward from territories lost to the Soviet Union. Amid such upheaval, the fate of one nurse accused of betrayal might fade quickly from official record, but not from local memory. Historians studying post-war Germany note that silence became a common coping mechanism. Families avoided discussing who joined the party and who denounced neighbors. Children grew up with partial stories. The word traitor could disappear from public display, yet remain embedded in private whispers. Even when Allied authorities intervened to prevent immediate punishment, social stigma could persist quietly for years. For British forces, the transition from combat to occupation demanded patience. Soldiers who had trained to defeat an enemy now distributed food, guarded warehouses, and supervised civil administration. Many wrote home describing the strangeness of walking through enemy towns without firing a shot. Some expressed sympathy for civilians struggling to rebuild. Others remained hardened by what they had witnessed in camps and battlefields. Victory was not emotionally uniform. The broader legal reckoning unfolded at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, beginning in November 1945. There, leading Nazi officials faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trials established a historic precedent. Individuals, not abstract states alone, could be held accountable under international law. This principle contrasted sharply with the arbitrary accusations that had defined the regime's final months. Justice, imperfect though it was, moved from mob spectacle to structured proceedings. Yet even formal justice could not fully resolve the moral ambiguities of ordinary lives. A nurse who had once saluted the regime but later showed compassion to a prisoner embodied contradiction. So did millions of others who navigated survival under dictatorship. Post-war Germany's reconstruction required acknowledging that complexity without excusing atrocity. It required distinguishing between ideological architects of terror and those swept along by fear, conformity, or limited choices. The transformation of Germany from a totalitarian state to a democratic society was gradual and uneven. In the British zone, efforts were made to re-establish local councils, encourage political parties, and reopen universities under new oversight. Civic trust had to be rebuilt from fragments. That rebuilding depended on replacing a culture of denunciation with one of legal process. Public punishment without trial, so common under Nazi rule, was deliberately rejected. Looking back, the moment in a ruined village square becomes symbolic of a turning point. The war's violence could easily have flowed into post-war vengeance. In some regions, it briefly did, but the long-term trajectory in Western Germany shifted toward institutional justice rather than collective retaliation. That shift did not erase pain or erase guilt. It did, however, create space for accountability within a framework of law. Memory remains the final judge. Decades later, historians continue to uncover personal stories from 1945, diaries, letters, oral testimonies. They reveal how fragile the boundary was between accusation and truth, between loyalty and humanity. A single painted word could threaten to define a person's entire existence, but history, when carefully examined, resists that simplicity. The end of World War II in Europe was not only a military conclusion, it was a moral crossroads. In shattered towns across Germany, people faced choices about how to treat one another when authority dissolved. Allied officers faced choices about how to exercise power in victory. The future of a defeated nation depended not solely on treaties signed in Berlin, but on countless small decisions made in squares, offices, and homes. In that sense, the story does not end with surrender. It ends with a question that echoes beyond 1945. When fear demands a scapegoat, who will insist on fairness? The answer, then as now, determines whether the aftermath of war becomes another chapter of injustice or the beginning of something better.